welcome back everyone. My name's Tyler Boronski. You're watching the T-Bells 5-2 YouTube channel, home for your top interviews with professional athletes and celebrities. Today I have a really special guest with me. He has been serving the Negro League Baseball Museum as the president since 2011, but prior to that you've been serving there since 1998 as the vice president of marketing. Mr. Bob Kendrick, first off, welcome to the show, and how are you doing today, sir?
I'm doing well, Tyler. Thanks so much for having me on the show. And, it's really interesting as we were going over my connection to the Negro Leagues Museum. Interestingly enough, it actually goes back to 1993.
Wow.
When I started the organization as a volunteer. And so we go from volunteer to becoming the first director of marketing for the Negro Leagues Baseball Museum, and now the last 6 years serving as the museum's president. So it's been a remarkable journey as it relates to my connection to this great museum. But it all started as a volunteer in 1993.
Absolutely. Well, you're definitely a big part of that museum over there in Kansas City. First thing I want to ask you about, I was actually on the website recently, and something that really intrigued me was when I clicked on one of the tabs, it pretty clearly says that the Negro League Baseball Museum is not a Hall of Fame.
Yes.
For maybe potential visitors and the listeners of this interview, can you maybe speak on the mission statement of the museum and maybe what potential visitors can expect when they come and see the exhibits?
Well, the late great Buck O'Neill, who was the longtime chairman of the Negro Leagues Baseball Museum, was adamant about the fact that this would not be a Negro Leagues Hall of Fame. The initial idea, Tyler, was to create a Negro Leagues Hall of Fame. But Buck said, no, we don't need a separate Hall of Fame. If you were good enough, you should be enshrined in the National Baseball Hall of Fame. So instead, that led us down the path of creating a museum. It was far more important for us to preserve, celebrate, educate, than it was to create a pseudo Hall of Fame when you knew from the onset that you had a finite piece of history.
Sure.
What was going to happen when you inducted that last player. And so we believe, so our job as a museum is to advocate on behalf of those legendary Negro League stars in hoping that they will one day get their rightful place in the National Baseball Hall of Fame. And of course, currently there are 35 Negro League players and or officials who are enshrined in the National Baseball Hall of Fame. So we set and embarked on a mission to preserve, celebrate, educate the public about a once forgotten chapter of baseball and Americana.
Absolutely. Now I'm curious, as a fan, how was the league formed originally? Like, what was the motivation behind starting the league? Was it just they wanted to create something for African Americans to just get the opportunity to play baseball?
Yeah, you were talking about an era of segregation. And so there had been black baseball being played for quite some time. We can go back to the late 1800s with African Americans playing baseball, but it didn't get a real organized body until 1920. Coincidentally, I am actually standing in the very building. I think they just found some music. I am actually standing in the very building that gave birth to the story of the Negro Leagues.
Wow.
The old Pastel YMCA, which is the birthplace of the Negro Leagues. This is the building that the Negro Leagues were actually formed in 1920. We are now restoring that old building. Ruth Foster led a contingent of 8 independent black baseball team owners into this very building that I'm standing in right now. And they signed the documents to start the Negro National League, the first successful organized black baseball leagues. The Negro Leagues would then go on to operate remarkably for 40 years, from 1920 until 1960.
Wow, that's unbelievable. Now, there's obviously been a lot of great players that have come through the Negro Leagues. Like you mentioned, there's 35 in the Hall of Fame. But most fans think of maybe 2 specific players that have played in the Negro Leagues, and that is Satchel Paige and Jackie Robinson. Would you say their careers are a good example of maybe the typical experience a player would get in the Negro Leagues, or would you say maybe they're like an exception?
Well, I think when we look at Satchel Paige in particular, Jackie played 1 year in the Negro Leagues. So it's hard to use his career as a barometer for the Negro Leagues themselves because he only played 1 year. But Satchel, of course, was a big star in the Negro Leagues.
Sure.
Satchel had a long career in the Negro Leagues and a long, successful career. And obviously, when you're talking about Satchel Paige, you're talking about one of the better-known players from the Negro Leagues. The lore and legend that surrounded Satchel followed him all the way into the Major Leagues. He's one of a handful of guys, though, who got that opportunity to transition from the Negro Leagues into the Major Leagues, even though we don't know how old he really was when he finally got there. But, when we start talking about the likes of Satchel Paige, the Josh Gibsons of the world, Cool Papa Bell, these are the guys who had the legendary careers in the Negro Leagues. They are great examples of the kind of athlete that call the Negro Leagues home. And they're the athletes that we celebrate every day and that we want baseball fans and those who are fans of history to understand just how talented this league really was. Now, Jackie comes here in 1945, but by the end of the 45 season, Branch Rickey had signed him away to go join his Dodger organization. And so Jackie was a good player when he was here in Kansas City. Quite frankly, there were other players who were better than Jackie Robinson who were in the Negro Leagues, but Jackie was the right man to be the first.
Wow. Okay. I did not know that. Now, Mr. Kendrick, I'm curious. Were these players able to make a living from playing in the Negro Leagues, or were they playing just solely based on the love of the game?
Well, they were definitely playing for the love of the game, but they were also making a living playing the game that they loved. Now, they weren't making, the owners in the Negro Leagues were making pretty good money. The players were making a decent living, again, playing the game they loved. The superstar players like Satchel and Josh Gibson, Cool Papa Bell, and these guys could go to Latin America and expand and extend their careers and make more money actually playing in winter ball. But again, Satchel Paige was one of the highest paid players in this sport, but he had to work year round to do it. But along the barnstorming circuits, everybody wanted to see the old man pitch. And so he would negotiate a percentage of the game. Nobody had that kind of deal.
Oh.
So entire towns were shut down to watch Satchel Paige do his thing. And so those guys, the superstars in the Negro Leagues, could make a pretty good living playing this game. But like Major League players at that same time, they all had to work year round to really earn a great living in our sport.
I gotcha. Now, like I mentioned earlier, the museum's in Kansas City. Obviously, that's home for one of the Major League teams, the Kansas City Royals. And I've noticed the last couple of years, the Royals, they held like a special day honoring the Negro Leagues. They wear the Kansas City Monarch throwback uniforms. And you're usually at the game, do maybe a few interviews. Can you speak on maybe how important that relationship is for the museum to have with the Kansas City Royals and Major League Baseball?
It's extremely important because what it does is it brings to life the legacy of the Negro Leagues to the current day fan.
Sure.
And so to have the Royals embrace the work that we do, to be able to participate in these throwback ventures, these games, and to see the clubs, not only in Kansas City, but in several Major League cities that pay homage to the Negro Leagues by putting on those uniforms, it helps the modern day fan connect to the history of our sport and the heritage of our sport. So it means a great deal. It's a tremendous promotional tool for the Negro League Baseball Museum. And so as we continue to get other Major League Baseball teams engaged and involved, it helps that fan base learn more about the history of the Negro Leagues. And so far, it has also helped push them through our doors here at the Negro Leagues Baseball Museum. And so it's an exciting partnership. We look forward to continuing to work with the Royals and other Major League Baseball teams around the country to celebrate the heritage of our sport.
Absolutely. Well, Mr. Kendrick, I just have one more question to wrap it up for you. You mentioned earlier about Mr. Buck O'Neil and his impact on the museum. I know he's a former Negro Leagues player and then helped start the museum. Can you speak on maybe your relationship with Mr. O'Neil and the type of guy he is, with the type
Oh
of guy.
man, he was amazing, and I was so blessed because I got to spend the better part. Oh God, I met Buck in 1993,
Wow.
and then when I started working at the museum full time as an employee in 1998, Buck O'Neil and I got to travel. I got to travel all over the country with Buck O'Neil. Man, I got to hang out with Buck O'Neil, and they paid me to do so. I would have done it for absolutely nothing. It was a tremendous blessing.
Wow.
He was one of the most amazing human beings I've ever met. People ask me all the time what I remember most about Buck, and I tell people, you always felt better leaving Buck than you did when you came to see him. and there are very few folks who strike you in that manner. Obviously, he had a tremendous career in the Negro Leagues, but most of us who fell in love with Buck O'Neil, we fell in love with the man who told us about these heroes of the Negro Leagues, and the man who demonstrated so beautifully and so vividly that you could indeed get further in this life with love than you could with hate. And I think that's what endeared him to a legion of fans, just by the way he exemplified that, and the fact that he was so charismatic and so compelling in his determination to make sure that the legacy of the Negro Leagues played on. I moved to the outside of the building, which will bear his name, and I don't know if you can see over my shoulder, that's a mural of the late great Buck O'Neil, which adorns the building, which will become the Buck O'Neil Education and Research Center, just a block away from where the museum operates. And so Buck O'Neil, needless to say, still looms large in Kansas City, but also in the baseball world. And it's important for us that people never forget Buck O'Neil.
Absolutely, no doubt about that. Mr. Kendrick, just can you give maybe some social media plugs so the future visitors of the museum can maybe follow you guys on Twitter or Facebook?
Oh, absolutely. Of course, you can find more information about us at NLBM.com. You can follow me on Twitter at NLBMPrez, and then we're also on Facebook as well. And so, we hope that people will make their way to Kansas City to experience, and I'm biased, what I think is the best baseball history museum anywhere in the world, because here you're going to learn a story that had remarkably escaped the pages of American history books. So the moral majority of the people, Tyler, who come to see us, they come now expecting to meet some pretty good baseball players, and you leave not being disappointed, but you're going to walk away with an even greater appreciation for just how great this country really is. And that is all encapsulated within the story of the Negro Leagues. And then, of course, alongside it, some of the greatest baseball players to ever put on a baseball uniform, and the passion that they had for this sport that allowed them to overcome tremendous social adversity to go on to play the game that they love.
Yeah, most definitely, Mr. Kendrick. Well, I want to thank you for coming on, sharing your insight, and next time I'm in Kansas City, I'll be visiting you, Mr. Kendrick, so I'm looking forward to that.
You gotta come see me, and when you do, the ribs are on me.
Hey, I appreciate that. I know that's what you guys famous for, those ribs, so I'll make note of that. So thank you, Mr. Kendrick. Appreciate it.
All right, thanks for having me.
Take care. And fans, you can follow the YouTube channel at TBLs512, the Facebook page at TBLs512 Interviews, and on Twitter at Ty Boronski10. That's TYBORONSKI 10. Make sure to follow Mr. Kendrick on social media as well. So thank you, Mr. Kendrick. Take care.
All right, stick through. Okay, bye now.